Can you explain what we're going to do?
We are going to head to France and Belgium to follow my great-great-grandfather's First World War service. Frederick George Hill was born in Clapham. He married Julia Collins in 1898. They lived in Battersea and had 8 children. He was a bootmaker, but enlisted in the army on 18th of January 1915 at 38 years of age, ending up in A Company of the 5th Battalion of the South Wales Borderers. After several months training, the 5th Battalion headed to Southampton, and on the 17th of July 1915 at 5:30 p.m. they boarded the paddle steamer SS Empress Queen and began their journey over the English Channel. Their ship docked at Le Havre at 1:15 a.m. and at 7 o'clock they disembarked. Over the next few days they began their near 200-mile journey to the front line, likely marching much of the way. On the 20th of July they entered the small town of Tilk, where they billeted in local farms. At 7:40 a.m. on the 23rd, they marched from Tilk to Hazebrouck, arriving at 4:30 p.m, billeting in an unfinished hospital. The next day, they left Hazebrouck, crossed the River Liss at St Venant, a place where the Welsh would distinguish themselves 25 years later, in the next Great War in 1940. By noon they arrived in Hamay, having covered 10 miles, and rested in the local farms. On the 31st they moved once again through various towns and villages, ending up in Les Sarres. At Les Sarres, they were introduced to the Indian Marut Division, who were manning the front line. Here, each company would spend 10 days in the trenches under instruction from the Indian Corps in the Neuve-Chapelle and Festubert sectors. When not in the line, they would continue training in the nearby Ypres forest. This continued for some weeks till they moved closer to the line at Torre, where they mostly carried out night work for several weeks. This was to change on the 25th of September at what would be the start of the Battle of Loos. 2nd Lieutenant Rose took 25 men of A Company who, armed with trench mortars, were to fire upon German strongpoint known as the Pope's Nose. Also, 2nd Lieutenant Lochner took more men of A Company, armed with machine guns to support the left of the line. Those not used would carry out road repairs nearby. With the new ground taken in October, they moved to new billets in Chateau Gour. It had been badly hit by artillery, the roof was in very poor condition and there was barely any glass remaining, but it was the place the battalion became quite attached to. The rest of 1915 there was not much change, mostly moving between the tuning fork line at Gour, Le Torre and Cornet-Marlow, usually undertaking road repairs, building trench tramways, trench repairs and some mining close to the enemy. The work was almost always carried out at night, as the German machine guns would have their sights trained on any areas they could see work was being carried out. On March 14, 1916, the Germans exploded a mine beneath the northern salient of Neuve-Chapelle, known as Duck's Bill. Half the salient was destroyed and most of the garrison, including a works party of the 5th, were killed or wounded. Captain Croft rushed across the now destroyed Duck's Bill to reorganise survivors before returning to look for help. Several men of the 5th volunteered, and along with Lieutenant Lochner, dashed across the open ground to support what remained of the garrison and help put up a fight, though sadly 2 men of the 5th were lost. However, it prevented the Germans exploiting the success of their mine detonation and the line was held. For this, Captain Croft was awarded the MC and Lance Corporal Hibbert the DCM. A similar event happened a few days later when the Germans detonated another mine under the Colvin Street Trench, not far from the Duck's Bill. Sergeant Bridgewater, who was in charge of a party of the 5th working in a nearby mine gallery, called his men to action, who manned the parapet and assisted the remaining garrison to hold the position. These were not the only times men of the 5th South Wales Borderers had shown incredible bravery. On March 8th, a shell landed directly through the mine pump house roof, killing 2 of the 3 men manning the essential air pump to the mine. Despite being wounded, Private Rees continued to pump air into the mine as if nothing had happened, saving many lives. A similar event happened a few days later when a shell burst directly in a mine shaft. Private Williams remained at his post, pumping air by himself for nearly an hour before he could be relieved, again saving the lives of those in the mine had survived the blast. By the end of April, the 5th were taken out of the line for 3 weeks training before heading towards the Somme region. By the 14th, half of A Company, along with their HQ, was based in Albert. The other half staying in Henencourt. They were placed under the 8th Infantry Division, who had no pioneer battalion at the time. They would remain in this area for some time, constructing trench tramways and road making. On the 6th of June, all companies of the 5th were engaged in digging a new fire trench 750 yards long, 150 of those being out into Nomads land overlooked by the German lines at Bruxelles. This was described as being a triumph of speed, efficiency and noiselessness, and it was so quietly done that the Germans never spotted it, and there was not a single casualty despite 1,200 men being out in the open, including some Royal Engineers who were putting up barbed wire. Not a single piece of the white chalk that sat below the surface was allowed to show. Every piece was placed into sandbags and carried away to be used or disposed of elsewhere. Not long later, it was discovered the Germans were planning to raid the Nab, a salient 80 yards wide and 150 feet deep. 180 men of the 5th were sent up one night to fill the existing trenches with barbed wire and dig some shallow bombing trenches behind, separated by further wire. If the Germans attacked, the wire would be a nasty surprise and those caught up in it would be handled by those in the bombing trenches. It was difficult work in narrow spaces and in moonlight, and there were a handful of casualties, though the Germans, possibly realising what had been prepared, never did attack. The days that followed involved further tasks, including trench work at Coniston Road, which was done under fire, building work at Henencourt Wood, including a rifle range, work in Albert around the Marmont Bridge, and road building at Crucifix Corner, which was again carried out under fire. The 24th of June marked the start of a continuous 7-day bombardment by the Allies onto the German lines in an attempt to soften up defences for the upcoming attack. By the start of the attack on the 1st of July, 1.5 million shells were fired, as well as 19 gigantic mines which were detonated beneath the Germans' feet. Loch Nagar was the largest of these. 27 tons of explosive was detonated 90 feet below the surface, completely destroying around 400 yards of trenches and reportedly throwing earth over 4,000 feet in the air. This marked the start of the Battle of the Somme. On the first day alone, over 19,000 Allied soldiers would be killed and another 38,000 wounded. The bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. Fortunately for the 5th, they were to remain just behind the advance in readiness, with part of A Company holding the trenches previously occupied by the advancing troops 70th Brigade, though they often headed into no man's land as stretcher bearers to retrieve the wounded. 5 were killed and another 5 wounded. The rest of A Company continued repairing trenches, tramways and artillery bridges, doing their best to keep the attack going. The next day, on the 2nd of July, the 5th were returned under the command of the 19th Division and were mostly employed in carrying supplies such as explosives, ammunition and water to the newly captured La Boiselle, as well as digging a trench through what was previously no man's land so that the wounded from the ongoing battle could be evacuated. Sometimes groups of the 5th were taken as bombing parties to help clear out the remaining Germans in the village. Lieutenant Hall, who was described as essentially a fighter rather than a pioneer and previously awarded the MC, led a group of the 5th through their own artillery to close in towards the enemy before they had a chance to recover from the shelling. They successfully drove the enemy some way back into their trenches. He was noted as handling rifle and bomb most effectively himself, but was killed just as he attained his objective, aged just 20 years old. On the 10th of July, the 5th Battalion were finally allowed some rest around Bézieux Wood. In the last 10 days, the 5th had suffered 40 casualties, which was relatively light compared to others. For the next week, they remained at Bézieux Wood, where they had concerts, parades, letters of praise for their outstanding work, and most importantly, rest. On the 19th of July, they made their way back to the line, and on the 22nd, they were positioned in Mammoth's Wood, where they were under heavy shell fire and gas attacks, leading to them digging in just outside the wood. Around here, they were mainly utilised in trench construction and ultimately trench repairs from enemy shell fire before moving over to Freicourt Wood on the 26th. And, among other tasks, were responsible for constructing a new frontline trench from northeast of Bazentin-le-Petit to High Wood. Another attack was to take place on the 30th of July to finally try and capture the strategic high ground of High Wood. The 5th were brought up to follow just behind the initial advance and consolidate and hold any captured ground. Despite a creeping barrage to attempt to soften the German defences, resistance was strong and the South Wales borderers were hit hard, with 36 men killed and over 180 wounded. The 5th were withdrawn from the line the next day, but the battle would continue for another week, although Allied forces did not succeed in capturing the whole of High Wood. For the next 3 months, the 5th were fortunate to spend time away from the lines, resting, training and helping to train newly arrived outfits. The battalion played football against 56th Brigade, winning 4-1. A rugby match was played against a New Zealand team and won 8-0. But the rest was not to last, and in October they headed back to the line for an upcoming attack west of Grand Court. They carried out the usual road, trench and tramway repairs, as well as a new task of creating trackways for tanks, which proved difficult as enemy artillery would get at least one direct hit on these a day. 3 weeks of preparation took place before the attack began, to finally drive the Germans out of the Somme. Once again, the 5th were used to help consolidate the captured ground, and with the objective of Grand Court taken, they took to work repairing the Lucky Way trench, as well as digging a new communications and fire trench at the new front line just outside the Somme. The Battle of the Somme was over, and on 24th, 2 German Minenwerfers were found and dug out by members of A Company near Mouquet Farm and brought to the battalion HQ as war trophies. The next few months were spent filling in shell holes and carrying out various other repair work in relative safety. The 5th once again showed off their sporting ability by winning 2-0 at the tug of war against 19th Division Signals, winning 6-4 at football against the 19th Division Train Team, and finally 6-1 against the 19th Division Signals. On May 1917, everything was to change, when the 5th Battalion marched to Ypres in Belgium for their next part in the Great War. The weather here was much better and the conditions were much improved from what they had grown used to. However, on May 6th, the Germans put a heavy artillery barrage down on Ypres, Part of the 5th were billeted in the infantry barracks, whose 3-foot thick walls gave just enough protection to prevent too many casualties, but the rest were in much less protected cavalry barracks, leading to 20 killed and 18 wounded. The 5th would find themselves opposite the German strongpoint of Hill 60, and A Company were working on trenches such as Grand Fleet Trench under heavy German shell fire. "17 metres beneath them, tunnellers were hard at work digging under the German lines, an operation which had been ongoing since April 1915. After a few days, the 5th had been moved to work in the line opposite Whitesheet, and were employed making dugouts, track and road making, along with bridges over trenches so artillery and newly arrived tanks could cross over. This was all in preparation for a new upcoming attack. On the night of the 6th of June, a thunderstorm raged, but by midnight had cleared, and a routine Allied artillery barrage began. Aircraft cruised over German trenches, masking the sound of Allied tanks making their way to starting positions. By 2 AM, everyone was in position. 30 minutes later, the barrage stopped, and birdsong could be heard in the deafening silence. And suddenly, at 3:10 AM, the mines at the end of the tunnels, which the 5th had been working over just a few weeks before, were detonated under the Germans, obliterating Hill 60 as well as 18 other mines across the Messines Ridge. In total, 450 tons of explosive were set off, contributing to around 10,000 German casualties in the region that day. It remains as one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, surpassing the ones previously used in the Somme the year prior. This marked the start of the Battle of Messines. Allied artillery opened up at maximum effect, starting a creeping barrage, and all known German artillery positions were bombarded with gas shells. Then the attack began. The 5th, who were part of the 19th Division, were to be used in the line northwest of Whitesheet. There were 5 objectives: red, blue, green, black and mauve lines, mauve being just along the edge of Oosterveen Wood. In total, a planned advance of 2,500 yards. A Company followed 57 Brigade straight to the Black Line and helped consolidate the ground from Esteminet Crossroads to Oosterveen Wood, constructing strong points and tracks. The operation was a success, and the 5th suffered relatively well, with 5 killed and 27 wounded. The 5th would remain in this area for weeks to come as they carried out work in preparation for the next attack. But things were not going to be easy for Hill, A Company, or the rest of the 5th Battalion South Wales Borderers.
Can you read the war diary entry for 31st of July 1917?
31st of July 1917. A Company, Oboe Extension, Olive, towards Blue Line. Dig a new communications trench 200 yards to a depth of almost 5 feet. B Company, Orr Avenue and Extension dug and improved trench, cleared and widened, 80 yards dug, repairing and improving rear part of trench. C Company, Preston Trench, 1:30 PM to 12 midnight, repairing damage done to trench, several attempts made to extend trench but unable to in account of heavy machine gun and shell fire. D Company, Preston Road Communication Trench, digging continuation of communication trench and repairing portion of trench damaged. 180 yards fresh trench dug to a depth of 4 foot 6 inches. Company has to withdraw at 8 am after working 2 hours and worked on repairing extensive damage to existing communication trench. Wounded to hospital. Lieutenant L.V. Kent died of wounds later same day. Killed in action. 39329 Lance Corporal Morris. (14022) Private Davis. (24060) Private Johnson. (41038) Private Woodcock. (41009) Private Jones. (24790) Private Meek. (29296) Private Cotterell. (14943) Private Phillips. (41039) Private Hill. And I have this letter sent to his wife. In answer to your letter, 41039 Private Hill, Frederick George, was killed on the 31st of July in Olive Switch Trench. This trench runs through Ravine Wood, which is southwest of Holbeek. He is buried in Olive Switch at 010D88. I deeply regret that this must destroy his widow's hope. Commander, 5th Battalion, the South Wales Borderers. The 31st of July was the first day of the Third Battle of Ypres, also known as the Battle of Passchendaele. An almost constant rain led to horrific fighting conditions against a heavily defended German line. Prior to the battle, 3,000 guns fired around 4.5 million shells over the course of 2 weeks to try and soften the German defences. This had churned up the battlefield and destroyed any drainage systems. People and horses drowned, tanks became stuck, artillery was unable to advance with any progress made by the infantry. What was left of the objective of Passchendaele was not taken till November 10th, with the total number of Allied casualties being over 250,000 men and German casualties in the region of 200,000. 61 Victoria Crosses were awarded for actions during this battle, 14 on the opening day of the 31st of July alone. Yet the war was still to carry on for another year.
in the morning we will remember them.